And welcome back to our lecture on research ethics. At this point, you've heard the lecture on all of the things that can go wrong when people are given the power to conduct whatever they want by calling it an experiment. Let's go ahead and focus on the good things that came out of all these awful circumstances that are part of our psychological history. One of the main things that came out of this is what we call the APA Code of Ethics. And the APA Code of Ethics is an ethics code that our governing body, the American Psychological Association, holds all therapists and researchers to. Within the Code of Ethics, there are two main sections. The general principles, and these principles are ones that psychologists should strive for, and then there are ethical standards. These are ones that are guidelines and standards for conduct, and these are the ones that can actually be enforced. In other words, general principles are what things people should be doing, but the ethical standards are what things are the things that people have to be doing. If we were to look at those general principles, they break down into more subcategories. This includes the ability to not hurt other people, the ability to uphold standards of conduct, the ability to be honest, the ability to be fair, and the ability to respect people because all people inherently have worth. To learn more about these general principles, please refer to the APA Code of Ethics online. One of the other things that came out of all these horrible acts that were done in the name of experimentation is the idea that we have to think about research as causing harm. And one of the things we believe is that all scientific research may cause harm. Even activities which are seen as mundane and relatively safe are not free of risk. For example, let's say that you are doing a study about test-taking behaviors. You have this conducted within a classroom. All the activities that people are doing are very similar to what they would do in part of a class. But as one of your participants is walking into the room, they step on a banana peel and they slip. Now, that's not technically your fault. You did not leave the banana peel there. However, because somebody was participating in your research and they happened to get harmed while participating in your research, that does actually make it your responsibility. So you have to see all research as being potentially risky. It's taking people out of what they would normally be doing and putting them within a research situation. Since all research is viewed as risky, there are actually two levels of risk. The first is what we call minimal risk. And this is risk that is generally no greater than what would be encountered in daily life. So the example of the study I gave for you that was talking about test-taking behaviors, that's an example of something you would do in a college classroom in a traditional class setting. In this experiment, you would be putting people in situations that are very similar to what they experience as students. Therefore, the risk is really no greater than what would generally be experienced in daily life. People could slip on a banana peel in a classroom. People could slip on a banana peel in your research study. That is part of what makes it minimal risk. The second category here is risk, and that is everything greater than minimal risk. So as soon as you want to start introducing medications, treatments for medical illnesses, psychiatric illnesses, you may be engaging in therapeutic situations. These are all examples where you are experiencing risk that is greater than what is experienced in daily life. Therefore, they would be examples of studies that would fall within the risk category. Here's an example of what Mount St. Mary's considers to be minimal risk. So minimal risk would be anything that involves voice recordings, moderate exercise by healthy volunteers, anything using existing data, anything where the research has to do with perception, cognition, game theory, test development, where we're not actually manipulating people's behavior, but we're just simply observing what they're doing. Also, minimal risk would be anything that is traditionally used within an educational setting, and anything that has to do with educational testing, anything involving surveys or interviews except when the interviews or surveys are recorded where people can be identified. So, for example, videotaping people is not considered minimal risk. Audio recording is, but video is not. Another exception here would be when we're talking about responses which would possibly indict somebody towards criminal or civil liability, if it might cause financial strain on the person or cause them to lose their job, or if it's survey or interview procedures about really delicate subjects in life, such as illegal behaviors, drug use, sexual behavior, alcohol, etc. Anything where people are being observed within public is considered minimal risk. And then any other categories that Health and Human Services have considered to be minimal risk, Mount St. Mary's also considers to be of minimal risk. In 2002, the American Psychological Association developed a set of ethical research standards that applies to the research process. This includes boundaries of competence. That means that researchers who are conducting research need to be doing so only if they're competent in what they're doing. That means they have some sort of either training or educational background related to research design. We have ethical standards regarding delegation of work to others. When we especially start looking at dissertation and student work and how the work is divvied up, there are ethical standards related to that. We also have this ethical standard where we have to avoid doing any harm. You also need to seek institutional approval. That is either your institutional review board, or in the case of Mount St. Mary's, we have a human subjects board. This is a board of people who review all the studies that are coming in and then approve you to do your study because it meets the ethical guidelines of your institution. APA would like us to avoid deception within research. They also want to make sure that all of our research subjects have some guarantee of privacy, anonymity, or confidentiality. They also require that we provide our participants with what's called an informed consent. Now, deception has been historically a tool of psychologists. Deception is the deliberate act of misleading or withholding information to give a false impression for the purpose of concealing knowledge or creating a research variable. If you think about the example where we talk about the Hawthorne effect, the Hawthorne effect was where researchers were trying to improve the productivity of workers. And so what happened was they went in to study these participants, studied the workers. Just the mere presence of them being there caused the workers to improve their production. We call that the Hawthorne effect. The idea that when people know they're being watched, they actually act more like they're supposed to be acting. If you're afraid the Hawthorne effect will happen in the study that you're conducting, one of the things that you may use is the idea of deception. So instead of telling people that you're going to be looking at how productive they are, you could perhaps say that this new person here is training and is trying to learn the ropes. That would be deception. Now, as I said, this is discouraged by the American Psychological Association. However, it's not prohibited. Psychologists would like to use deception because they typically want unbiased or natural behaviors. They don't want behaviors that are indicative of how people perform in laboratory settings. They want results that are indicative of how people behave in real life. When can you use deception? You can use deception when previous research studies have shown that non-deceptive procedures are not feasible. Deception may not be employed in studies where there is any physical pain or severe emotional distress that is being experienced by the participants. And if you're using deception, you have to debrief them. That is, you have to tell them about the deception as early as possible, usually at the completion of the participation. We call this debriefing, dehosing, desensitizing. Basically, this is a physical document that is read to participants that tells them of the true nature of the study at the completion of the study. Of course, we're not only going to tell participants about their research participant at the end of the study, we also want to tell them beforehand, right? That's one of those APA Code of Ethics requirements. An informed consent is a document that is gone over with the participants prior to engaging in research. All potential participants are told in advance about all aspects of your study. That is the good and the bad. So they're told about benefits and risks to them participating. Why we do this is because we want to give them the information so they can see whether they want to participate in the study. Right? The information here is intended to be used by the potential participant to make an informed judgment with respect to their participation. Participants are also informed that they may decline or may be able to discontinue the study at any time. When you're creating an informed consent sheet, there are some basic topics that need to be covered. You need to explain the topic of the research study, give the affiliation of the research study and the contact information for somebody who is conducting it. You need to tell them what they will experience within the study, the benefits and the risks, and this may be directly to them, or it may also include benefits and risks to the general public of them doing this. Tell them about information about place and time of the research, how you will keep their actual identity confidential and anonymous. You need to inform them that they are free to decline or quit the study at any time. You need to give an offer to answer all questions. Then you need to give an actual space for them to consent. That is, they normally have to sign off on an informed consent sheet. You also have to offer to provide feedback based on the results. Here are the requirements for Mount St. Mary's informed consent sheet. As you'll see, it's very similar to what I just went over that were the guidelines from the APA. Mount St. Mary's is expecting that we have some sort of statement of procedures and purposes. It has to involve an explanation of the purpose of the research, a description of the procedures that will be followed, the duration of the participation, and which, if any, procedures may be considered experimental. We have to have a statement of the risks or discomforts that the subjects may experience. It also must include a description of any foreseeable risks. You need to also offer a statement of associated benefits for the subject. You need to include a statement that participation is voluntary and that our subject may withdraw at any time. They need to include a statement where the subject may refuse to participate, may discontinue, and they will not have any sort of penalty or loss of benefits to which they would otherwise be entitled. You need to include a statement that the subject is given the opportunity to ask questions about the procedure and that they were answered prior to agreeing to participate. You also need to give them the contact information about who they should contact if there's a research-related problem. And last, Mount St. Mary's requires that our statement has some sort of level of confidentiality that's guaranteed to our subject. You must explain to the extent confidentiality can be kept or maintained. Mount St. Mary's in particular has what we call a Bill of Rights. All studies that are done through Mount St. Mary's have to include experimental Bill of Rights, in addition to the informed consent sheet. The Bill of Rights tells participants what their rights are as a participant. So they are told that they will be told about what the study is trying to find. They will be told about the procedures involved with this, the risks of this, the benefits. You may be told about what other choices they have or other opportunities other than being involved in the study. They have to be allowed to ask questions. If it's related to medical treatment, they need to be told where they can seek additional medical treatment should any complications arise. They also have the right to refuse to participate or change their mind about participation at any time. They have the right to receive a copy of the sign and date consent form. And they have a right to be free of pressure when considering whether to agree to be in the study or not. And then here is all the information about our Human Subjects Committee and their contact information. Most large research institutions have what we call institutional review boards. And institutional review boards are the boards that review the research proposals and provide an impartial check for ethical problems in order to protect participants. And they do this by performing what we call a risk-benefit analysis. That is, does the study provide more benefits than risks to participants and to the public at large? At Mount St. Mary's, instead of an institutional review board, we have a slightly different type of process. It's called a Human Subjects Committee. And that's just related to the type of research that's typically done here at Mount St. Mary's, as opposed to the type of research that's typically done at a large institutional research institution. Now, all of these ethical principles I've been talking about in relation to human participants. What about animal participants? Certainly, the use of animals within research has improved in their ethical and moral considerations over the last few decades. Now, people may have a variety of feelings about how they feel about animals being used in research, but why do researchers like to use animals in research? They like to use animals because with animals, we can breed them to provide specific genetic traits, and we can also very closely control their environmental conditions. So if we're doing a study related to sunlight exposure, you can actually have animals experience a certain amount of daylight, whereas you could not control that with a human participant. Other nice thing about animal participants is they're reliable. They show up, and they show up at multiple points in life. So you can conduct what's called longitudinal research with animals, where you see how they progress from infancy to adolescence to adulthood. They're reliable in the sense that they always show up. They are always in their cages. They are always right in your lab where you need them. And they're also the appropriate choice when we have experimental procedures that are deemed to be too risky for human research. So, for example, most medical research actually goes through animal trials prior to going through human trials because the risks are seen to be greater in the initial stages of research. Once we have some sense that this drug is possibly safe for human use, then it is tested on humans. American Psychological Association has some standards for animal research. That is, they're required to abide by all federal and local laws for acquisition, care, use, and disposal of research animals. The people who are conducting studies with animals have to be trained in the research methods and the care of all the laboratory animals. They have to make sure that all the people who are involved in the labs receive adequate training in order to care for, maintain, and handle the species that is being used in research. We have an ethical responsibility to minimize discomfort, infection, illness, and pain of the animals used in research. Painful procedures are only allowed to be used when an alternative procedure is not available. Whenever surgical techniques are performed, they must be done under the appropriate anesthesia and also all medical processes need to be in place to minimize pain and infection. When animals are used in research and they have to be killed in order to find out the results of that research, you need to make sure that you do so in an ethically responsible manner. Make sure that the animal is experiencing a rapid death and a painless death. And make sure that this is within the related guidelines for that particular species. By now, I hope you see some of the good that has come out of having people experience bad things in the name of experiments. The APA Code of Ethics is our main guiding principle that we use as psychologists, that is, as therapists and as researchers. And it governs all the ethical and moral considerations when using animals and humans with research. So by now, I hope you understand what the APA Code of Ethics is and some of the implications of the APA Code of Ethics use within research.